Chapter 8. Neb did not move. The sailor uttered one word. "Living," he cried. The Negro did not answer. Spilett and Pencroff turned pale. Herbert, clasping his hands, stood motionless. But it was evident that the poor Negro, overcome by grief, had neither seen his companions nor heard the voice of the sailor. The reporter knelt down beside the motionless body, and, having opened the clothing, pressed his ear to the chest of the engineer. A minute, which seemed an age, passed, during which he tried to detect some movement of the heart. Neb raised up a little, and looked on as if in a trance. Overcome by exhaustion, prostrated by grief, the poor fellow was hardly recognizable. He believed his master dead. Gideon Spilett, after a long and attentive examination, rose up. "He lives," he said. Pencroff, in his turn, knelt down beside Cyrus Smith. He also detected some heartbeats, and a slight breath issuing from the lips of the engineer. Herbert, at a word from the reporter, hurried in search of water. 100 paces off he found a clear brook swollen by the late rains and filtered by the sand. But there was nothing, not even a shell, in which to carry the water, so the lad had to content himself with soaking his handkerchief in the stream, and hastened back with it to the cave. Happily the handkerchief held sufficient for Spilett's purpose, which was simply to moisten the lips of the engineer. The drops of fresh water produced an instantaneous effect. A sigh escaped from the breast of Smith, and it seemed as if he attempted to speak. "We shall save him," said the reporter. Neb took heart at these words. He removed the clothing from his master to see if his body was anywhere wounded. But neither on his head nor body nor limbs was there a bruise or even a scratch, an astonishing circumstance, since he must have been tossed about among the rocks. Even his hands were uninjured, and it was difficult to explain how the engineer should exhibit no mark of the efforts which he must have made in getting over the reef. But the explanation of this circumstance would come later, when Cyrus Smith could speak. At present, it was necessary to restore his consciousness, and it was probable that this result could be accomplished by friction. For this purpose they made use of the sailor's pea-jacket. The engineer, warmed by this rude rubbing, moved his arms slightly, and his breathing began to be more regular. He was dying from exhaustion, and, doubtless, had not the reporter and his companions arrived, it would have been all over with Cyrus Smith. "You thought he was dead?" asked the sailor. "Yes, I thought so," answered Nebraska, "and if Top had not found you and brought you back, I would have buried my master and died beside him." The engineer had had a narrow escape. Then Neb told them what had happened. The day before, after having left the Chimneys at daybreak, he had followed along the coast in a direction due north, until he reached that part of the beach which he had already visited. There, though, as he said, without hope of success, he searched the shore, the rocks, the sand for any marks that could guide him, examining most carefully that part which was above high water mark, as below that point the ebb and flow of the tide would have effaced all traces. He did not hope to find his master living. It was the discovery of the body which he sought, that he might bury it with his own hands. He searched a long time, without success. It seemed as if nothing human had ever been upon that desolate shore. Of the millions of shellfish lying out of reach of the tide, not a shell was broken. There was no sign of a landing having ever been made there. The Negro then decided to continue some miles further up the coast. It was possible that the currents had carried the body to some distant point. For Neb knew that a corpse, floating a little distance from a low shore, was almost certain, sooner or later, to be thrown upon the strand, and he was desirous to look upon his master one last time. "I followed the shore 2 miles further, looking at it at low and high water, hardly hoping to find anything, when yesterday evening, about 5 o'clock, I discovered footprints upon the sand." "Footprints?" cried Pencroff. "Yes, sir," replied Nebraska. "And did they begin at the water?" demanded the reporter. "No," answered the Negro, "above high water mark, below that the tide had washed out the others. "Go on, Neb," said Spilett. The sight of these footprints made me wild with joy. They were very plain, and went towards the downs. I followed them for a quarter of an hour, running so as not to tread on them. 5 minutes later, as it was growing dark, I heard a dog bark. It was Top. And he brought me here, to my master. Neb finished his recital by telling of his grief at the discovery of the inanimate body. He had tried to discover some signs of life still remaining in it. But all his efforts were in vain. There was nothing, therefore, to do but to perform the last offices to him whom he had loved so well. Then he thought of his companions. They, too, would wish to look once more upon their comrade. Top was there. Could he not rely upon the sagacity of that faithful animal? So having pronounced several times the name of the reporter, who, of all the engineer's companions, was best known by Top, and having at the same time motioned towards the south, the dog bounded off in the direction indicated. We have seen how, guided by an almost supernatural instinct, the dog had arrived at the Chimneys. Neb's companions listened to his story with the greatest attention. How the engineer had been able to reach this cave in the midst of the downs, more than a mile from the beach, was as inexplicable as was his escape from the waves and rocks without a scratch. "So you, Neb," said the reporter, "did not bring your master to this place?" "No, it was not I," answered Nebraska. "He certainly could not have come alone," said Pencroff. "But he must have done it, though it does not seem credible," said the reporter. They must wait for the solution of the mystery until the engineer could speak. Fortunately, the rubbing had re-established the circulation of the blood, and life was returning. Smith moved his arm again, then his head, and a second time some incoherent words escaped his lips. Neb, leaning over him, spoke, but the engineer seemed not to hear, and his eyes remained closed. Life was revealing itself by movement, but consciousness had not yet returned. Pencroff had, unfortunately, forgotten to bring the burnt linen, which could have been ignited with a couple of flints, and without it they had no means of making a fire. The pockets of the engineer were empty of everything but his watch. It was therefore the unanimous opinion that Cyrus Smith must be carried to the Chimneys as soon as possible. Meantime, the attention lavished on the engineer restored him to consciousness sooner than could have been hoped. The moistening of his lips had revived him, and Pencroff conceived the idea of mixing some of the juice of the tetras with water. Herbert ran to the shore and brought back 2 large shells, and the sailor made a mixture which they introduced between the lips of the engineer, who swallowed it with avidity. His eyes opened. Neb and the reporter were leaning over him. "My master! My master!" cried Nebraska. The engineer heard him. He recognized Neb and his companions, and his hand gently pressed theirs. Again he spoke some words, doubtless the same which he had before uttered, and which indicated that some thoughts were troubling him. This time the words were understood. "Island or continent?" he murmured. "What the devil do we care?" cried Pencroff, unable to restrain the exclamation, "now that you are alive, sir. Island or continent? We will find that out later." The engineer made a motion in the affirmative, and then seemed to sleep. Taking care not to disturb him, the reporter set to work to provide the most comfortable means of moving him. Neb, Herbert, and Pencroff left the cave and went towards a high down on which were some gnarled trees. On the way the sailor kept repeating, "Island or continent?" To think of that, at his last gasp! What a man! Having reached the top of the down, Pencroff and his companions tore off the main branches from a tree, a sort of sea pine, sickly and stunted, and with these branches they constructed a litter, which they covered with leaves and grass. This work occupied some little time, and it was 10 o'clock when the 3 returned to Smith and Spilett. The engineer had just wakened from the sleep, or rather stupor, in which they had found him. The color had come back to his lips, which had been as pale as death. He raised himself slightly, and looked about, as if questioning where he was. "Can you listen to me without being tired, Cyrus?" asked the reporter. "Yes," responded the engineer. "I think," said the sailor, "that Mr. Smith can listen better after having taken some more of this tetra jelly. It is really tetra, sir," he continued, as he gave him some of the mixture, to which he had this time added some of the meat of the bird. Cyrus Smith swallowed these bits of tetra, and the remainder was eaten by his companions, who were suffering from hunger, and who found the repast light enough. "Well," said the sailor, "there are victuals waiting for us at the Chimneys, for you must know, Mr. Smith, that to the south of here we have a house with rooms and beds and fireplace, and in the pantry dozens of birds which our Herbert calls carucas. Your litter is ready, and whenever you feel strong enough we will carry you to our house." "Thanks, my friend," replied the engineer, "in an hour or two we will go. And now, Spilett, continue." The reporter related everything that had happened, recounting the events unknown to Smith, the last plunge of the balloon, the landing upon this unknown shore, its deserted appearance, the discovery of the Chimneys, the search for the engineer, the devotion of Neb, and what they owed to Top's intelligence, etc. "But," asked Smith, in a feeble voice, "you did not pick me up on the beach?" "No," replied the reporter. "And it was not you who brought me to this hollow?" "No." "How far is this place from the reef?" "At least half a mile," replied Pencroff, "and if you are astonished, we are equally surprised to find you here." "It is indeed singular," said the engineer, who was gradually reviving and taking interest in these details. "But," asked the sailor, "cannot you remember anything that happened after you were washed away by that heavy sea?" Cyrus Smith tried to think, but he remembered little. The wave had swept him from the net of the balloon, and at first he had sunk several fathoms. Coming up to the surface, he was conscious, in the half-light, of something struggling beside him. It was Top, who had sprung to his rescue. Looking up, he could see nothing of the balloon, which, lightened by his and the dog's weight, had sped away like an arrow. He found himself in the midst of the tumultuous sea, more than half a mile from shore. He swum vigorously against the waves, and Top sustained him by his garments, but a strong current seized him, carrying him to the north, and, after struggling for half an hour, he sank, dragging the dog with him into the abyss. From that moment to the instant of his finding himself in the arms of his friends, he remembered nothing. "Nevertheless," said Pencroff, "you must have been cast upon the shore, and had strength enough to walk to this place, since Neb found your tracks." "Yes, that must be so," answered the engineer, reflectively. "And you have not seen any traces of inhabitants upon the shore?" "Not a sign," answered the reporter. "Moreover, if by chance someone had rescued you from the waves, why should he then have abandoned you?" "You are right, my dear Spilett." "Tell me, Neb," inquired the engineer, turning towards his servant, "it was not you could not have been in a trance, during which—" "No, that's absurd. Do any of the footprints still remain?" "Yes, master," replied Neb, "there are some at the entrance, back of this mound, in a place sheltered from the wind and rain, but the others have been obliterated by the storm." "Pencroff," said Cyrus, "will you take my shoes and see if they fit those footprints exactly?" The sailor did as he had been asked. He and Herbert, guided by Neb, went to where the marks were, and in their absence Smith said to the reporter, "That is a thing passing belief." "Inexplicable, indeed," answered the other. "But do not dwell upon it at present, my dear Spilett, we will talk of it hereafter." At this moment the others returned. All doubt was set at rest. The shoes of the engineer fitted the tracks exactly. Therefore it must have been Smith himself who had walked over the sand. "So," he said, "I was the one in a trance, and not Neb. I must have walked like a somnambulist, without consciousness, and Top's instinct brought me here after he rescued me from the waves. Here, Top. Come here, dog." The splendid animal sprang, barking, to his master, and caresses were lavished upon him. It was agreed that there was no other way to account for the rescue than by giving Top the credit of it. Towards noon, Pencroff having asked Smith if he felt strong enough to be carried, the latter, for answer, by an effort which showed his strength of will, rose to his feet. But if he had not leaned upon the sailor he would have fallen. "Capital," said Pencroff. "Summon the engineer's carriage." The litter was brought. The cross branches had been covered with moss and grass, and when Smith was laid upon it they walked towards the coast, Neb and the sailor carrying him. 8 miles had to be traveled, and as they could move but slowly, and would probably have to make frequent rests, it would take 6 hours or more to reach the Chimneys. The wind was still strong, but, fortunately, it had ceased raining. From his couch, the engineer, leaning upon his arm, observed the coast, especially the part opposite the sea. He examined it without comment, but undoubtedly the aspect of the country, its contour, its forests and diverse products were noted in his mind. But after 2 hours, fatigue overcame him, and he slept upon the litter. At 5:30 the little party reached the precipice, and soon after, were before the Chimneys. Stopping here, the litter was placed upon the sand without disturbing the slumber of the engineer. Pencroff saw, to his surprise, that the terrible storm of the day before had altered the aspect of the place. Rocks had been displaced. Great fragments were strewn over the sand, and a thick carpet of several kinds of seaweed covered all the shore. It was plain that the sea sweeping over the isle had reached to the base of the enormous granite curtain. Before the entrance to the Chimneys the ground had been violently torn up by the action of the waves. Pencroff, seized with a sudden fear, rushed into the corridor. Returning, a moment after, he stood motionless looking at his comrades. The fire had been extinguished, the drowned cinders were nothing but mud. The charred linen, which was to serve them for tinder, had gone. The sea had penetrated every recess of the corridor, and everything was overthrown, everything was destroyed within the Chimneys.